Hey everyone, my name is Athanasios Bonas and I am a published Pankration researcher. I've received a few requests to comment on Kajan Johnson's new grappling style, and in particular the relation it may or may not have to ancient Hellenic groundwork found of course in Pankration. Let's begin.
I think that God showed me something. I think that He helped me to rediscover something ancient and bring it back into modern times.
Many times people will discover something truly innovative and entirely by accident. And if they consider that a message from a higher power, then more power to them. That's not something they or their idea should be judged on.
I say this because about a year and a half ago, I was preparing to go into professional competition in jiu-jitsu. Before the very first tournament, I had an absolutely catastrophic neck injury. I don't even really know what happened. I was grappling. I may have shot a takedown. Honestly, I don't remember, so my head probably ran into something pretty hard. Could have been the floor, could have been the guy's hips, I'm not really sure, but it shut my arm off. It was probably 3 months where I wasn't really able to lift my head at all, and my arm probably didn't work for somewhere around 6 months.
Head, neck, and spine injuries are something that can haunt you for your entire life. Play it safe. From here on out, there is not much to talk about up until he reaches the explanation of his grappling style. I'll edit the video just enough to give you the gist of what he's saying up until I can begin the analysis. Make sure to watch the full video on his channel. Link is in the description.
In going back to rolling, I was so terrified of injury. So when I was grappling on my first couple days back, I decided to just play a game. And the game was, don't let your head get close to your opponent. Don't let your head get close to the ground. That took a lot of jiu-jitsu away from me. That took so much of my game and threw it out the window, because most of the moves, most of the pins, most of the positions, almost all of the submissions require you to be close to the ground with your head, with your chest, be close to your opponent with your head, with your chest. And when I started to use those two keys and to try to take down and control my opponent, I started to realize that it was way easier than everything that I'd been doing before that. But most of freestyle wrestling, a lot that we focus on anyway in freestyle wrestling, especially in the context of MMA, is getting to the legs, right? Where's your head when you go and shoot a double leg? Where's your head when you shoot a single leg? Where is it when you shoot a high crotch? It's very easy for your opponent to grab. When I see Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu practitioners, when I compete against them, almost always they are trying to get under me. When I compete against freestyle wrestlers, almost always they are trying to get under me. I believe that's a huge flaw. I think that over is better than under. And I think there's a lot of things we could do, we can see that demonstrate that. There's no way I'm the first person that does this. There's no way that I'm the first person that thinks like this. I feel like this is what people used to think. This is what people used to do before the arts of freestyle wrestling and Japanese jiu-jitsu. If you go back and look at ancient sculptures, ancient paintings of like the original Olympics, right? And the style of wrestling that they would be using, there's a lot of handcuffing, there's a lot of pushing on the head, there's a lot of control using the head. There's not a lot of pinning by lying on top of the person. I'm not saying that's not effective. I think there are stronger ways to grapple. And they're just following those two really basic rules, right? Taller and higher.
So, in regard to the ancient practice of this style of combat, he's both correct and incorrect. Freestyle wrestling goes as far back as mythology in ancient Greece. I've made 3 videos on the subject on the mythological origins of groundwork and how the mythology manifested into reality via the accomplishments of Melissus of Thebes. The first figure that the ancient Hellenists attributed freestyle wrestling to was the king of Eleusis, Kerkion, and for jiu-jitsu style combat, the African king Antaeus. What Kajan says about BJJ's tactics of falling on your back and using that to your advantage is exactly what Antaeus did according to mythology. So there is precedent that this existed even as far back as the 7th century BCE, which is a conservative estimate. But Kajan is right in that you will almost always see the hero, which is Heracles for example, depicted on top of his opponent. Ultimately, Antaeus was the original guard puller, but Heracles would defeat him by standing his ground and lifting him up at the opportune moment to crush him with his overwhelming strength. Remember, mythology for the Greeks were not just fantasized stories, they held meaning and lessons in all regards. After Antaeus, we have Kajan, who was also a groundwork specialist and a freestyle wrestler. According to the legends, his wrestling style was incredibly successful until he faced Theseus. He tried again and again to take him down, but Theseus stood his ground and thwarted his low takedown attempts. The pottery paintings of Theseus against Kajan verify that Kajan was attempting a double leg takedown. They either depict Theseus defending against it, pulling him up, or in the process of performing a suplex, which is how he ended up killing the villainous king of Eleusis. In essence, the style of fighting that Kajan suggests is what was considered heroic and ideal. It is what Heracles and Theseus used, and it's what the majority of vase depictions display for these heroes. Remember, the marketability of vases was based on popularity, meaning they painted what the people wanted to see, not necessarily what was most used or most effective in combat. The exception here is the Panathenaic vases, which were given as prizes to the victors and were not meant to be sold. Unfortunately, less than 1% of these have survived. Where Kajan Johnson is incorrect is that he seems to imply that this was the predominant and perhaps even only style that existed. Antaeus and Kajan show us that the BJJ and freestyle wrestling mode of fighting was used since at least the time in which these myths were created. Again, a conservative estimate being in the early archaic period. But the way in which they fought was considered by many at the time to be deceitful or even villainous. If you watched my video on John Danaher and GSP, you'll remember when I mentioned Plato wasn't a fan of groundwork. He particularly didn't like the BJJ or freestyle wrestling mode of combat, as he equated them to false glory and being unworthy of celebration. He believed it was of no use in the battlefield and overall impractical outside of combat sports. Even Melissus of Thebes, despite being praised, was considered by Pindar to be deceitful in his approach that led him to victory. He was compared to a fox, forestalling the swoop of an eagle, which were his opponents. Melissus used to conquer combatants far larger than himself by using a technique called hyptiasmos, according to Pindar's Scholiast. He would intercept striking attempts and take them to the ground by falling on his back with his opponent, ultimately leading to their submission. Of course, Melissus was also favored because he was the reigning champion of chariot racing, so his fighting approach may have been excusable solely based on his overall fame. How successful this style was versus the style that Kajan suggests is debatable and overall difficult to tell. Pankration did not have weight classes, and Pan-Hellenic competitions saw fighters enter from all over Greece with varying fighting styles. Against larger foes and against particular styles of striking or even wrestling, the BJJ-like approach appears to have been a successful method of grappling, which is why it still does appear on vase depictions. However, it is apparent that the people of ancient Greece favored Kajan's approach immensely, at least as spectators, and this shows in the imagery that has survived, which is mostly in favor of the fighter who stands tall and remains above his opponent. But overall, both approaches were used throughout the many centuries of competition. So what I can say for sure is that neither approach was a definite counter to the other. Rather, they were different styles of combat with their inherent merits and demerits in terms of efficacy. But the re-emergence of this style through trial and error will definitely help diversify and add additional layers to today's grappling arts.
It's not really my system, but God's system. And I think that this system that I have rediscovered is the way God meant us to grapple.
I'm sure Heracles would agree with both of these statements. Give Kajan Johnson's video a like and subscribe to his channel. And if you'd like to help me in the authorship process of writing an academic book on Pankration, visit my Patreon, where I'm pretty close to my goal and there's exclusive content for every subscription. Any one of them helps. I'll catch you in the next video. Cheers.